What's the rarest block you can mine in Minecraft? Some of you might think diamonds, ancient debris, or even deep slate emerald ore. But what if I said it's none of these, but actually Bitcoin? Well, that's exactly what this giant redstone machine can do. It can mine Bitcoin from within Minecraft without the use of any commands or mods. It's the result of a 2-year collaboration between SoundTomb and myself, Armadillo28. In this video, we'll go over exactly what this machine does, how it does it, how Bitcoin works, and most importantly, exactly how much money we're getting from this machine. But before we worry about Minecraft, how does any Bitcoin miner work?
So the first step is to make a Bitcoin account and download every transaction since the beginning of time. You then download a group of new transactions called a block, plus some extra metadata. You add a timestamp and then format it into 80 bytes called a block header. Then you take that block header and run it through SHA-256 twice. SHA-256 is an algorithm designed by the NSA, and you're going to be very familiar with it by the end of this video. It's what's called a hash function, which means that it takes in some data and then generates a 256-bit number that looks completely random. The same data is always going to give you the same number, but there's no way to predict the number ahead of time. In the metadata that you downloaded from the Bitcoin network, there's another 256-bit number called the target, and you do a little comparison. If the hash is bigger than the target, you're out of luck. You have to tweak some stuff in the block header and then run it through the hash function again. But if the hash isn't bigger than the target, then the block that you downloaded gets accepted by the network, and you get a 3.125 Bitcoin reward for all the computation you just did. The Bitcoin that you make is actually just generated on the spot. It doesn't come from any account. It's exactly like printing money. So mining Bitcoin really just means hashing a block header, tweaking it, and then hashing it again until your answer is low enough. At this point, you might be wondering why the network would offer prize money for people to do this. The short answer is that it makes it really hard to forge transactions, but if you want a full explanation, we've linked some really good videos in the description that go into a lot more detail. So to build this in Minecraft, we need to first think of a way to get the block header into the game. We run that into SHA-256 and then compare it with the target. Then we have to get a signal out of the game saying whether or not we were successful. So how are we going to do that? Well, actually, we're not the first people to try this. Commander Redstone built a full Bitcoin miner in Minecraft in 2021, but it uses commands. It's really cool, and you should check out the video, but we wanted to build something that you could make in survival, theoretically, with no cheats. Because of that, most of our build is going to be really different to his, but the way that he gets data in and out of the game is really smart, and it all comes down to the chat. First, he uses Python to interact with the Bitcoin network and get the block header ready. Then he uses a player bot to type commands into the chat, getting data into the game. To get data out, he can just read the chat log, which is in a file on your system, and check for a success message sent by another command. If the Python script reads a success message, it can send the block off to the network, and he can pay off his student loans. So, like Commander Redstone, we use Python to get our block header from the network, and a player bot to relay that data into Minecraft. Alright, let's just program our player bot to place redstone blocks in a binary pattern encoding the block header. Then we can connect that to Sammy Uri's general purpose computer, the Chungus 2, which can do the rest of the work. That seems fairly simple. You just place blocks and connect it to something that's already built. Why did it take us 2 years? Well, the problem is that both things take a really long time to run. The target that I mentioned before is automatically set by the network so that a block takes about 10 minutes to get mined on average. This means that we have a fairly strict time limit. Even if our block header is valid, if we take more than 10 minutes to check, then we won't get the reward because the network will have beaten us to it and already accepted somebody else's block. Because speed is such a factor in whether it works or not, we decided that if we were going to label this as being possible in vanilla Minecraft, we would have to run the game at native speed. So, not only do we have to run an algorithm designed for real-life 32-bit computers, but we're racing against the clock to get it all done in under 6,000 ticks.
So the method we chose for getting data into the game was to use a lectern. A lectern with 15 pages will output a different signal strength to a comparator depending on which page is being read. Now, believe it or not, you can actually change pages in a book using the page up and page down keys. This ended up being really convenient for us because now we can input hexadecimal signals with just 2 keys. So let's say we want to input these 4 bytes into the miner. This is what that looks like at full speed. Yeah, it's a little quick, so let's go through it one bit at a time. In this view, the book that's shown on the left is the one in the lectern that we're getting our signal from. You can see which page it's on in the top corner, and our output from the miner is shown on the bottom right here. Bear in mind that data shown on this isn't automatically put into the miner, it first has to be sent into a register. When we open up the lectern, we're on page 1. Now whenever there's a book in a lectern, there'll always be a signal strength of at least 1 coming out. To avoid having to take the book out of the lectern in order to be able to get a signal strength of 0, which we found to be unreliable at high speeds, what we're going to do is subtract 1 signal strength from the output comparator. Now this means that our comparator is already reading out the correct signal strength, but in order to actually write that to memory, we're going to have to change the page. That's because the write signal that we use is the direct redstone output that triggers from the lectern when you change pages. Now luckily this has an easy workaround. We simply go up to page 2 and instantly back down to page 1. This triggers the redstone pulse from the lectern, which we use as the write signal, but crucially it doesn't change the signal strength of the comparator output. Next is 7. We simply spam page down 7 times in order to get up to page 8. Remember, we're subtracting 1 from the output, so this gives us our output of 7. Now 15, represented as F, appears to show a flaw in our plan. Since we've subtracted 1 from our output in order to be able to represent a 0, we can no longer actually reach a 15, since page 15 will now give us a signal strength output of 14. To get around this, we actually give page 15 a special shifting function. When we go to page 15, the write signal output pulse is blocked, so nothing is written to memory. Instead, the subtraction on the output of the lectern is taken away. Once this shift has taken place, to finally input the 15, we simply hit page up and page down in quick succession. Since now the subtraction is gone, page 15 will give us a signal strength of 15, which gives us the correct output. Finally, the 1. With the subtraction removed, it would appear that we could just go to page 1. But in order to make 0 possible to input again in the future, we have reassigned page 1 to the reverse shifting function. So, as when we input 15 before, we return to page 1, the write signal is blocked and the subtraction is added back. Then we go up to page 2, which inputs the 1, as now the subtraction is back. So now we have a stream of signal strengths coming from the lectern circuit that the player is interacting with. But they're not quite in a usable state for the miner just yet. That's because these are hexadecimal signals in the form of signal strengths, but the miner deals only in binary. That's because it has to do bitwise operations. That's operations that work physically with individual bits. So we need to convert this stream of hexadecimal signals into a stream of binary signals. The way we're going to do that is with this red coder design that we got from Matt Batwings. This circuit takes one hexadecimal signal as an input and outputs 4 binary signals stacked on top of each other conveniently like this. So now we have a stream of nibbles. That's closer to what we need, but it's still not exactly right, because the miner deals with 32-bit numbers rather than 4-bit numbers. Luckily, this is a fairly easy conversion. All we do is we put 8 of these nibbles in a row into the circuit called the distributor. This has a series of small registers that can hold 32 bits of data. It then reorders them and stacks them on top of each other into a vertical format that can be used by the miner. The last step is to store all of the data that we need. Now, because the data in circuit is quite lag sensitive and the mining circuit is quite lag generating, we don't want to run them at the same time. And so what we have to do is we have to store all of the data that the miner is going to need ahead of time. This amounts to 512 bits of data. So this is an easy solution. We just have a large shift register that can hold 512 bits of data. So that's it. Now we have all of the data in the game that the miner is going to require during the mining process.
Now that we have all the data in the game, we're ready to attack the behemoth that is SHA-256. So let's start with some basic components and then build up from there. First is a shift register. This is like a regular register, but the memory cells are laid out in a line so that when you clock it, the signals all shift along by one place. So if we just stack this vertically, then we have a whole list of binary numbers that we can move along one place at a time. Like Arma said, we have a couple shift registers in our data in circuit. They all basically use the same design, and it works great for the most part, but there are some situations where we need a few more features. Sometimes we want to be able to load the data into all of the registers at once, rather than shifting it in bit by bit. To do that, we can put comparators in between the locked repeaters. Now, when we lock those comparators, our shift register becomes a normal register, and we can write to all the repeaters at the same time. While we're doing this, we also want to be able to load from 2 different data sources, one from the front and one from the back. We use the same mechanism of comparator blocking to block the signal that we don't want to write.
The first component that we built in Minecraft was the rotates. These are pretty simple conceptually. Let's say we have some data and we want to apply a write rotate of 5 to it. To do this, we take our data and move it all 5 bits over to the right. Any bits that fall off the end are wrapped around and put back at the start. Now in Minecraft we want to do this exact same thing but vertically rather than horizontally, just because that's how we have our data set up. And the way we're going to do that is with walls. When you close a trapdoor next to a column of walls, all of the walls within that one column will change state, but not the walls in the adjacent columns. We can detect this shape change with an observer and use it to get an output. Since we have separate signals from each wall, we can reorganize the outputs compared to the inputs, and this can act as a rotate. In this example, we have a right rotate of 3 and 4 total inputs and outputs. So the top input will be rotated 3 blocks down and activate the bottom output, but the second input will be rotated back round to the top output because it's gone off the bottom and wrapped around back to the top. In the real build, we use exactly the same mechanism but on a much larger scale. Now this does have a side effect of lowering all of our outputs to below all of our inputs by a total of 64 blocks, but it's worth it because this circuit only takes a total of 4 ticks from input to output. Now this is only possible because the amount by which the circuit has to rotate is fixed, it never changes. If it did have to change, we wouldn't be able to use this kind of circuit, but we're taking full advantage of the fact that we can to make it as quick as possible. Another advantage of lowering all of the data to below the input is it means that we can use the space up top that we've just gained in order to put other circuitry there, and we'll get to that later. But we do have to get the data back up, and to do that we use these bubble columns. We don't use these to rotate the data at all, we just use it to get it back up.
Next, we have a bitwise XOR and a multiplexer. For the XOR, each output bit is a 1 if the 2 input bits are different, and a 0 if they're the same. Then a multiplexer is just a signal that chooses between 2 numbers. We'll also need a 32-bit adder, which we'll get to later. So far, all these components have been pretty standard, but these next ones are a little weird. They both deal with 3 32-bit numbers as their input. Majority is a component that outputs a 1 if there are 2 or more 1s in the input. We can do this by connecting up 3 different AND gates. And then the other one is called choice, and it's 32 1-bit multiplexers stacked on top of each other. That's kind of hard to visualize, at least for me, so let's look at an example. Okay, we got 3 inputs, let's call them A, B, and C. So for each bit, we compare all 3, and if A is 0, the answer is B, and if A is 1, the answer is C. Do that for every bit in the number, and that's choice. So that's it for our basic components. Let's have a look at how they fit together. SHA-256 doesn't actually read its input all at once. It reads it in 512-bit chunks. The first chunk is then loaded into a shift register called W. There are 16 cells in total, and I've labeled them W0 to W15. Some of the cells go into a group of components called the round function, which I'll get back to later. Then the output of that round function gets fed back into W0, making a feedback loop. We clock this circuit 64 times, reading from W0. This gives us 64 different values for W that are all based on the original chunk. So this whole setup so far is known as the expander. As well as the 64 W values that we get from the expander, we also have 64 constants called K. These are just numbers that are defined by the NSA, and they don't ever change. We also have a register called the state, which holds 8 32-bit numbers. You might have noticed that that adds up to 256 bits. That's because the state is going to hold our final output. To start with, we load it with 8 more constants. Then, the state, the expander, and K all feed into a component called the compressor. It's kind of the same deal as the expander. The state gets copied into 2 shift registers called the working variables. The individual cells in both registers are labeled A to H. The working variables, along with the current W and K values, then get put through another round function. This time, the round function has 2 outputs, connecting to the start of each shift register. Because there are 64 Ws and 64 Ks, we also clock the working variables 64 times. Once the compressor's done, we add our working variables back to the state, and then finally we're done with 1 chunk. We've got to do this whole thing again for every single chunk that we have. Luckily for us, the block header can fit inside just 2 chunks. So after we fed in the chunk and done the whole thing again, the state will contain the output of our hash. Okay, so now we're done, right? Well, we're done with the first hash, but remember there are 2. So now what we gotta do is take the value in the state and use it as our new first chunk. Then, do everything again. And finally, the state will contain our actual answer. So the only thing left to talk about is these mysterious round functions. Really what's going on is that we take the components from before and combine them in different ways according to the paper. So to see how everything fits together, let's have a look at the actual build. This is the shift register for the expander. Let's add some rotates and shifts to W1 and W14. Then we XOR them together. Next, we add our XOR gates to W0 and W9. And finally, we bring our output back up to W0. Now for the compressor. We start with our working variables and then add some rotates to E and A. Like with the expander, we XOR them together. We send A, B, and C into majority, and then E, F, and G into choice. From here, it's just a lot of addition. We add the current W and K values to H, one of the XORs, and choice. From here, the signal splits in two. On one side of the split, we add D and plug the answer back into E. On the other side, we add majority and our other XOR, and then plug the answer back into A.
So because there are 3 chunks to process, and each chunk runs the round function 64 times, we got to run that round function 192 times to complete a hash. This means it's got to be pretty fast. Remember, there's a time limit of approximately 10 minutes, let's say 9 so we have time for data in, data out, and some headroom. That means that the round function has an absolute limit of 56 game ticks, but ideally we want it a bit faster so that we have that headroom. This might seem like plenty of time, but there's quite a lot to get done. Every game tick we add to the round function adds in 9.6 seconds to the total time of the hash. In our first drafts, the most problematic component was the adder. The miner is 32-bit, so if the carry of the adder were to take even 1 game tick, we'd go over that maximum time limit. To get around this, we designed this adder that takes 0 ticks to run. It's instant. We achieve this by using an interesting quirk of comparators called comparator priming. Normally, comparators take 2 game ticks to turn on or off after the input changes. Additionally, unlike repeaters, comparators don't accept most pulses of 2 game ticks or less. The comparator simply doesn't turn on. But if we give a comparator that quick pulse, and then 2 game ticks later power or unpower the comparator, the changing input will propagate through the comparator instantly without having to wait for the usual 2 game ticks. By using subtick delays, we can chain several of these instant comparators together and use them to form the logic gates needed for an adder. There is one complication though, the carry. Unlike all of the other parts of the adder, where each place value can be processed in any order or at the same time, the carry has to propagate strictly from bottom to top, from least significant bit to most significant bit. This means we have to have a priming pulse at every place value with the correct subtick delay. To get this, we use a bubble column. When the block at the bottom is changed between a soul sand and a magma block, the changing direction of the bubble column can be detected by an observer, and most importantly, this update is completed from bottom to top. This allows our carry to propagate signals instantly. Since building this, I've been made aware of some much more elegant designs using comparator priming, but this design works just fine within the Bitcoin miner. There's also one other variant of this adder in the build too. In the state, there are some adders where the speed doesn't matter so much as they're only used a few times throughout the whole hash, but the size is constrained. The variant therefore is only 4 blocks wide, but keeps that instant carry, leading to a fairly quick overall operation. With the help of the instant adder and many other fast components, we managed to get our final clock speed down to 40 game ticks, that's 2 seconds. That means that all 192 iterations of the round function take about 6.5 minutes.
Another way that we optimize the compressor's round function is with a pipelining design that I found in this paper. This kind of bent our brains a little bit, so I won't fully explain it in this video. Basically, what happens is that it uses multiplexers to work on 3 rounds at the same time, at the cost of a few extra rounds of setup. A chunk now takes 67 rounds instead of 64, but because each chunk is shorter, it's an overall time save. The only other component that we haven't seen in-game is K. All it is a big ROM that cycles through the 64 different constants. It uses bubble columns and observers to store the binary, and because the data doesn't actually move, it can't get out of sync if the redstone goes wrong. Let's add the compressor and expander to the rest of our build. The data in component gives us our chunk, which then goes into the expander. Then the expander feeds into the compressor. Let's also add in our K values. Great, so that's now the compressor totally done. Next, we gotta add our working variables to the state, so let's add 8 of the thin adders. This is where the extra space from the rotates comes in handy. Now we can connect the adders to our state. We connect the output of the state back to the adders and the working variables. When we eventually do our second hash, the state's going to need to be used as our input chunk and connect to the expander. So to do that, we made the state also act as a shift register. Then we just connect the far end directly into the expander. This line is huge and it has to go the entire length of the build, so it's one of my favorite parts. All that's left now is the control circuit for hashing a chunk. Arma came up with this really cool self-resetting ROM design that uses floated minecarts, because of course it does. We connect it to all our different components, and then we have SHA-256 in Minecraft. So now that we can calculate our double hash, we have to compare that result to the target. But before we do that, we actually have to generate the target from our block header. So how do we do that? Well, one of the 32-bit numbers in our block header is called n bits and represents a compressed version of the target. We then need to make 32 bytes of RAM. That's just some registers in a 5-bit decoder, so it's fairly easy to make. When we get a new target value, we fill the RAM with zeros. Next, we split our n bits number into 4 bytes. One of the bytes gives us a starting position in the RAM, and then we add the other 3, one after the other. Add a simple control circuit, and we're done. The 256 bits in the RAM is our target value. Let's nestle it in right here under the state. All we have to do now is check if the target's bigger than the state. But first, we need to talk about endianness. So all the binary numbers we've shown you so far have been written pretty much how you'd expect. That's called big endian. But there's another way of representing numbers called little endian. This is where you write all the bytes backwards. The problem is that SHA-256 uses big endian numbers and Bitcoin uses little endian numbers, so we have to reverse all the bytes in the state before we can compare them to the target. Luckily, our rotate circuit can also be used to rearrange bytes. As a bonus, it brings the state down 64 blocks, which is where the target is. Now we can finally compare the two numbers. We came up with this neat wallstone design for a comparison circuit that's infinitely expandable. Let's connect that up to the state and target, and we'll get our final output. We figured that we should make this out of gold blocks.
So now that we've completed the hash and we've compared it to the target that we calculated, we know in-game whether or not we've mined a Bitcoin. But for it to count, we need to tell the Bitcoin network as a whole. Normally, this would involve outputting the block header that we used to successfully mine the Bitcoin, including the nonce value that we used. But in this particular miner, we've engineered a unique, major simplification right into the architecture of the miner that I bet no other miner has ever used. Because our miner is so slow, we only ever get to check one nonce value in the 10 minutes that we have before the Bitcoin block changes. And we'll be able to submit whatever data we put into the game from the data in circuit straight back to the Bitcoin network. In both cases, we use the chat log for our data out. If it's a no, we haven't mined a Bitcoin, we open up a trapdoor underneath the player. This kills the player and we detect the death message in the chat. If it's a yes, let's turn around back here. We instead drop an anvil on our beloved pet down in the dungeon below. When a dog or a cat that's been named and tamed by a player is killed, a death message is sent into the chat of the player that tamed the mob. There is also a vegetarian option available for those who want it. If you go over here and flick this switch, instead of the dog being killed, the player will be killed in a different way, and we can detect that. Once a death message has been sent into the chat, we're able to pick it up with a small Python program that then broadcasts our data to the Bitcoin network. While we're in here, there's one other control in this room. This switch over here disables all of the specialized Bitcoin mining functions, such as the target. This just leaves behind the part that does the hashing. What we can use this for is we just use our data in as normal for however long our message is, and then run the machine with this button up here. It will output a 256-bit hash in the form of black and white pixels on this map. By taking a screenshot and running it through another Python script, we can get the output directly as text. This has nothing to do with the Bitcoin, we just thought we have a SHA-256 hasher in Minecraft, we may as well be able to use it without having to do all of the Bitcoin stuff too, just in case you happen to need a cryptographic hashing function within Minecraft. You never know.
So we now have a machine that can mine Bitcoin in Minecraft, in theory at least. But how much money does it actually make us? Based on the target value at the time of recording, the odds of any given hash being less than the target is this. Let's multiply that number by the reward of 3.125 Bitcoin. This gives us the average amount that we'll make every 10 minutes. This means that if we ran our build continuously for a year, we'd make about 2 Zimbabwe cents on average. That is, Zimbabwe cents from July 2008, about 6 months before Bitcoin was invented. So it does make money, at least on average. Or does it? We haven't factored in the energy costs of running a computer that's running the build. And we also haven't factored in the upfront costs of a computer itself. Not to mention, you also have to buy Minecraft. Given our odds, we can expect to mine a block if we run this many hashes, which will take at least a few hours. If we assume that during that time your PC draws 300 watts, then that adds up to 7.2 kilowatt hours per day. We're both living in the UK, so we did this in pounds. Energy prices may be different in different places, but we calculated the cost to be about £2 a day. That means that by the time we've run our build for long enough to mine a block, even though we'll have gained about £300,000, we'll have lost over 5 sextillion pounds. On second thought, I don't think we need to worry about the price of a PC or the price of Minecraft. We can always try and make the hash rate better by running lots of copies of the machine at the same time, but that doesn't really change the power cost very much. We knew from the start that it wasn't actually going to make any profit. I mean, it is in Minecraft. But the goal wasn't to make profit. The goal was to make a cool redstone build. So let's have a look at the full thing in action.
All things considered, for a first computational redstone project, we're really pleased with the results. I've always enjoyed videos of people turning real-life games and processes into redstone builds, but it's especially cool to see a build that actually links to real-world hardware and infrastructure, as this does with the Bitcoin network. It's by far the most ambitious redstone project either of us has attempted. In fact, it's the first major redstone project Soundtomb has attempted. The debugging was an absolute nightmare, but the coolest part is this. If we did mine a block with this setup, we'd of course get Bitcoin, but we'd also have the knowledge that real Bitcoin transactions were cleared using computational power from within Minecraft. It would have a permanent effect on the blockchain used by every other Bitcoin user on the planet. How would other people know though? Well, in the block header, you can include any data of your choosing in the metadata. This is called the Coinbase message. If we do at some point mine a block, you'll see a block with this message as part of the blockchain. Please do take a moment to have a look through the video description. It includes links to all the resources mentioned, including papers, Minecraft players and mods. Especially check out Soundtomb's channel, Bandcamp and website link below. He's also produced all of the music used throughout this video. Now that's all for this video. We may be posting some supplementary materials either on this channel or on my second channel, Armadillo29, so make sure you're subscribed to both to see them.